Wow, so life feels crazy, right? We're overstimulated, visually and mentally. It's noisy out there, even in here. And as a Gen Xer in my 50s, I've had to create my own rules to stay grounded and sane. These aren't trendy hacks either. They're personal life rules, that I learned, the hard way. And they've carried me through caregiving and financial stress, heartache. Today I want to share 10 practices that I live by, my own Gen X reality check. And I'm going to share these in case they help you find your footing as well. And first on the list is structured blocks. For me, if I'm going to go to the trouble of getting up at 5 a.m. in the morning because I want to get certain things done, I'm going to have a structure and a routine to follow. Otherwise, I would just get distracted and waste those precious high energy morning hours. I have a plan. I map it out. I even go so far as to write it down so I can rearrange things to make them most efficient with my time. I modify things if life changes, like bringing home a new puppy. But I have this plan ingrained in my head, and I know how it flows, and I have timestamps that I know when it hits a certain time that's that, got to move on to the next thing if I'm going to get out of the house on time. So my advice to you is this, block off one part of your day. Doesn't matter when it is. It could be early in the morning, like me. It could be late at night. It could be just your lunch hour every day. And you don't have to squeeze, 10 things into that block of time. Maybe it's just one very important priority that you use that time to focus on. Number 2 is honor commitments. This one, it's kind of important to know yourself. If you know how you are, when it comes to showing up for certain things, and that's a struggle for you, then don't commit anything in that area. And some of this learning, about yourself, it comes with age. I make few commitments. And the ones that I do make, I think long and hard about them because I don't want to flake on them. I want to see them through. And we don't only make commitments to others, we also make commitments to ourselves. And my commitments to myself, they're just as important, if not more, than those I make to others. I made a commitment to this YouTube channel. I made a commitment to take care of my mom. Those are just 2, but they're huge. But be selective on what you commit to. It's much more about quality here than quantity. And number 3 is have a stress relief valve. In the last decade, I've had to add many things that I can depend on to calm me down. I have a personality where I can get really hyped or agitated or fidgety very easily. So I have a toolbox of things that I use regularly. Things like stretching, or for me, watching history documentaries, deep breathing, visualization exercises. I can easily picture, a beach with ocean waves, and I can watch them, just lapping in and out, and that can calm me down. Reading, of course. Even walking my dog Benji. Although that's not always a stress-free activity. He's just this little 20-pound dog, but he's all terrier. We can go out of the house and there's a cat over here and a crow over there and a squirrel up there, and it's, if anybody's watching me, it's quite comical because he's jerking me and I'm just flailing, behind him. Yeah, I know I should have trained him better, but all those activities, they are counter activities to my natural tendencies, to get restless or to get too busy on things. We all need things like this that we know calms us down, and we need to be able to engage in them often and easily. Don't make them too difficult. Don't choose things that are hard to schedule or cost a lot of money or involve other people. Just a simple stress relief toolbox. Okay, just a quick mention before we continue on. If you find this type of information useful, and especially from a Gen X point of view, I would love for you to subscribe. And Benji would love for you to subscribe as well. Okay, back to the list. Okay, number 4 is to eat strategically. Now this one isn't about, bashing you for eating the wrong things, because I love my chips and sausage and ice cream, and while I continue to work on those areas, I have ways of counteracting, some of those poor food choices. And that's by picking several nutrient-dense foods and finding a way to get them in almost every day. Earlier I talked to you about having a block of time, in your day that you devote to those priorities. Well, this is kind of like that. You take one food where you can kind of hide a lot of things in it. And for me, that's a smoothie. I make one every single morning, and it enables me to get a lot of different ingredients in one glass, that I might not get otherwise. Now, the recipe for my smoothie, I kind of took Brian Johnson, he's the Don't Die guy. I took his nutty pudding recipe and kind of, tinkered around with it a little bit. I'll put that on screen. But the key is to find something like that. Whether it's a smoothie, whether it's oatmeal, that's another good one, soup, salads. Now I'm going to put a list here of the 10 most nutrient-dense foods. I'll put it here on screen. I'll put a link to it in the description box below as well. Maybe you can work on getting 5 of those, in somehow during the day. That's what you call eating strategically. Okay, number 5 is I live by my values. As a caregiver, I sometimes have to do a lot of sacrificing and compromising. And since I have a lot less time than I used to, I have to spend it on the things that matter most to me. If that's time to exercise or read or get outside, I just can't allow myself to go plop down on the couch and watch TV. Now, do I never do that? No, I do, but it's rare, and when I do, I am fully aware that it's a treat when I do it. My reality check is that I can't allow too many passive activities in my life right now. You just have to ask yourself, what matters to you? What do you want? And you may only have an hour a week or 10 minutes a day to devote to those things you truly, truly love. But that's okay. Honor that. And number 6 is embrace simplicity. As life gets a little more complicated, my reality check was that I have to make it simpler in other ways. But I have to do that on purpose. And whether that's, fewer clothes in my closet or minimal subscriptions each month, one bank, one investment firm, one credit card. I try not to have a whole lot of inventory at home either, except for toilet paper. But, it stresses me out when the pantry is cluttered and overflowing and, all the cabinets under the sink, you can't find anything in there. I've reduced, my linens, my towels, my sheets. The less you have to keep up with, whether it's physically or digitally. And I know a lot of people forget about this digital one because it doesn't seem tangible, but it can get messy so fast. But the less we have to keep up with, that's a blessing. And number 7 is try to forgive quickly. I have this method that helps me move on and just not hold grudges. And it's not perfect, but whenever I feel I've been hurt or I've been wronged, I visualize myself, walking across this long, bridge over this deep ravine, and I'm leaving it or that person behind. I just tell myself it's done and it's over. And that's the beginning of my healing process. I want to forgive because, otherwise I'll just poison myself. And whenever the thought tries to re-enter my mind, I just shut it down really quickly. I try not to ruminate on it. And even if, I still interact with that person that hurt me or whatever, I find a way to just mentally move past it. Now, I know with me, I will probably be emotionally distant from that person from that point on, but that's just how it is with me. Grudges and unforgiveness, they will drain you of your life force. Okay, number 8 is mark milestones. I make a point to set goals in all areas of my life. And whether they're written on paper or just in my head, I also make a point to celebrate achieving them. I make a big deal about it with myself. Whether I, just journal about it, my accomplishments, I'll write it down in a journal and date it. Sometimes I create my own little certificate and print it off. I did that when my YouTube channel reached 10,000 subscribers. I made my own little congratulations certificate. It's just a gesture because, I know how hard I've worked, to achieve that. I may put something, on my calendar and have it recur every year just so it reminds me, 3 years ago, this happened. I may celebrate it by, spending money, but that's rarely ever the case. I just like patting myself on the back, and I think you should too. But make a point to acknowledge and celebrate those goals and milestones that you achieve. And number 9 is acknowledge the path. There's the path we come from, the one we're on, and the path forward. And I'm not stuck in the past, but I respect where I come from. And I am very happy that I grew up in the era that I did. I am thankful to both of my parents, even though they made mistakes. But who hasn't? And not every path that we take will be one that we've chosen for ourselves. Sometimes those get chosen for us. And it might just be the one that you have to take in order to get to the next crossroads. Don't forsake your past. Just take the best from it and keep moving forward. Keep your eyes open for possibilities. Help others along the way if you can. It's up to every single one of us to be the best version of ourselves that we can be. And number 10 is positive declarations. Some people call these mantras. I always have several positive statements, floating around, in my thoughts, in my life at any given time. And I focus on these. Sometimes they are Bible verses. Sometimes it's just short phrases, that I'll put on a Post-it note, put on my mirror. It might say, I am strong and healthy. Or, I believe things happen for me, not to me. Doubt your doubts, not your hopes. If I'm going through an illness, I'll declare healing statements over myself. The key is to speak kindly to yourself, but be a warrior at the same time. We can tear anything down or build anything up just with our words. Now, I believe that most people know the destructive power that negative or harmful words can have. I mean, I think we learn that from an early age, but we forget that loving and positive words can have an effect as well. It doesn't just work on one way and not the other. So don't just let your circumstances, be what they are. If you want them to change, then start speaking out loud that they are changed. So these are just some of the rules that I've chosen to fit into my life. They help me meet, my health and fitness and spiritual goals. They enable me to juggle being a full-time caregiver, a full-time employee that works outside the home, and a creator here on YouTube. These life practices, they've helped me through a broken heart, calmed my nervous system, given me peace of mind. So I encourage each of you watching today to find those practices, those defaults that you can incorporate into your own life. They don't have to look like mine, but maybe my 10 gives you some ideas to start, because the world out there will beat you down. And sometimes, most of the time, the best person to patch you up is you. Let me know if you found this video helpful by hitting that thumbs up button. I appreciate each one of you for watching. Take a look at this video next on how to look and feel younger. I share 18 things that I do to slow down the aging process. Have a great week. And don't you forget about me. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.